Hello everybody. So here we are back in our 30-day video challenge, and I had mentioned before that I was going to talk about two more myths that pertain to the third eye and how we break out of our relationship patterns. Today I want to talk a little bit more specifically about the second myth pertaining to the third eye. So as I mentioned before, just an overview. So the third eye is one of your chakras. It's an energy center in the body, and it's in the center of your brow. The shadow aspect is illusion, so it is related to limiting beliefs and the illusion that you can have control over things or that you can make predictions about things every single time based on the past, right? But the lighter aspects of it are that if you can have a clear and balanced third eye, then you achieve a sense of wisdom, which is that you can make predictions, but you can still be flexibly open to the possibility that something may not turn out the same way every single time, okay? And that is basically an allowance for letting things show up in your life, perhaps in ways that you cannot anticipate, but still remaining open enough that you're able to recognize them when they come in, right? And so we related that to the first myth, which is if it's not logical, don't act on your intuition, right? And we talked about how the third eye allows you to experience the whole as greater than the sum of its parts because you are experiencing the whole experientially. Whereas our logical or our rational mind tends to look at things sequentially, right? It just looks at how one part adds on to the next, and it doesn't necessarily allow you to see the whole experientially. So today I want to talk about the second myth, which is that I am doomed to repeat the same patterns over and over again, right? Whereas it's my belief that the future is not defined by your past or by your parents' past, for that matter. And once you identify whatever this lesson is that your patterns are calling in, and you identify what your authentic self and your true desires are in your life, you can break out of those old patterns and really create the life that you want. So it does in part involve being able to call in and to recognize when the thing you're calling in arrives, even though it may not look the way you think it should, right? And also contending with what I call the victim-judge dynamic, okay? Some people refer to this as the inner critic and the wounded inner child, but that's this notion that there is an aspect of ourselves that may be victimized, and then there's another aspect of ourselves that is always punishing the victim, right? Within us, okay? And so to my mind, that really speaks to how we assign meaning to our experiences, the importance of personal narratives and or the self stories that we have, right? Because there's a lot of transformative power in the naming and the sharing of your experience, whether it's particularly when it has to pertain to our life losses. And so typically once we're able to do that, greater possibility opens up for changing that story. And I think I see a lot of that going on in the feed here, people naming and claiming their stories, and also other people responding to and fleshing out their stories. And then what happens is we start to step into what David White calls the conversational nature of reality, where we're able to be like, oh, well, that allows me to see, a little bit more. I have a tendency to think of, like we're talking about attachment wounds, let's say, or traumatic material or unresolved issues of grief and loss, that I tend to think of that as like we all have this kind of sun that we're sort of rotating around, and whatever those core issues are that have shaped us from childhood, they're sort of like that sun. And as time goes on, we sort of rotate around that sun, and as we gain more experience and knowledge and ideally higher levels of consciousness, every rotation gets a little bit wider. It moves a little farther out. And so that you're able to see things from a greater perspective. I call it a moon's eye view, but I don't necessarily think that you ever get over things in the way that we think about it. Like we have a tendency, like I have clients come into my office and they'll say, well, I've been in therapy before, and I talked about my past in this context or whatever. And so I know I had some mommy issues, but I worked on that and I'm over that now. So, okay, so maybe you recognized and worked on your mommy issues at the circumference at which you were at that time of your life, but maybe now you have moved out, right? Maybe now you are in a new circumference. And so now you're going to have to go back and revisit some of that from a new perspective, okay? And so the insight, you will gain new insights. It's called regression in service of the ego. So basically the idea is that sometimes you have to take 2 steps back in order to move 3 steps forward, right? So I don't think we ever actually get over things in the way that we have a tendency to want to think of them, which is kind of what I talked about the last time we talked about these things too, is like sitting with uncomfortable feelings, right? I think the uncomfortable feelings are always going to be there. I think it's about how well we sit with them and then the level of consciousness that we gain as we continue to sit with them, right? And this is not to say that we never struggle with new and experiences throughout our lifespan. I think of new experiences as being like planets that you encounter as you keep rotating around. And then there's like mini rotations around those planets, but they're all sort of rotating around the same thing too, right? So that's kind of like the visual that I have for that. Now, I want to give you just an example of this. Sometimes one of the things I've been kind of talking about in the feed here was our frame of reference, like how we're thinking about this. Also the conflict that we have in our own heads around these 2 aspects of ourselves, the victim and the judge, right? So I want to give you an example. One day I had a client come into my office and she was very tearful and red-faced and really apologetic about her tardiness. She came late. And she was feeling really anxious and kind of vulnerable to some punitive voices in her head. And so she basically said, you know, I have these horrible, terrible thoughts, and kind of went on to express some anger and guilt about how bad her thoughts were. And in that moment, she was both perpetrator and victim of an assault, right? Because, oh, I'm terrible, I'm having these bad thoughts. And so she's having the thoughts and then she's beating herself up for having them. And so then I said, well, you can't really control your thoughts. They come to you for a reason, and it's up to you to really decide what that's for. So maybe they're gifts, or maybe they're re-gifts. And then I suggested that we do a guided visualization that would allow her to sift through her thoughts rather than experience them as a deluge. And then we made art about it afterwards to contain that experience and help her make sense of it. So I chose that because when we have attachment issues, typically it's very early wounding. And because it's early wounding, it occurred at a time in our lives when we were young. And there's a certain cognitive developmental level, emotional developmental level that we are at when we are young. And if we're not allowed to develop that playful language, that inner language that children have, which is not necessarily words, right? It's images, it's metaphor, it's pretend play. It's color, it's movement, it's song, right? Children, you can hear children sometimes humming and singing songs when they think no one's paying attention, or even if you are paying attention, they don't notice you because they're lost in their own fantasy world. Okay, that's their language. And so you have that language buried in you somewhere. Everyone does. I don't care if someone says, oh, I'm not creative. Bullshit. Everyone's creative. It's in there. It's in you somewhere. Okay. And so, so I recommended a guided meditation so that she could make contact with that language, because to my mind, it's when we lose contact with that language that you become kind of a vacuum for all the punitive thoughts that come spilling in when you're feeling anxious. You're just a vacuum for it because you've become ungrounded. Okay. And so in processing that session with her, my client said, I've always been told that I am in control of my thoughts, as if it's supposed to make me feel better, but then I beat myself up for producing such bad thoughts. I prefer the idea of them as gifts, that they come to me for a reason and I can choose which ones I want to keep and which ones I want to return. Now, I have to confess, that statement that I made about her not being in control of her thoughts just kind of flew out of my mouth. And I actually wondered about the accuracy of it once I'd said it out loud, because in preparing for this session with her, I'd actually reviewed a lot of anxiety reducing meditations and other techniques to try to help her, all of which emphasize the point, you are in control of your thoughts. And so whatever possessed me to deliver the exact opposite message, I don't really know. And then I worried in that moment that I was encouraging her not to take responsibility for herself. But as we proceeded through the guided visualization, which I tend to make up as I go along, depending on what the client sees, okay, I realized that I was asking her to take responsibility, but it was to surrender a need for control. So to welcome the bad thoughts as well as the good thoughts, and thereby allowing them to move through you instead of just getting stuck. And so it was actually a lovely paradox. And it is that in the surrender of control, you actually gain it back. Okay. Now, this idea tends to fly in the face of that whole victim-judge dynamic that we all have within us. And it is, characteristic of what spiritualists often refer to as egoic thinking, because the dynamic justifies an over-reliance and a deification of a faulty logic and intellect, right? This victim-judge dynamic, because that is really what is sometimes referred to as the ego's domain. And that's where limiting beliefs and self-fulfilling prophecies come in. They absolve us of really taking responsibility for ourselves, right? Oh, I'm always going to be abandoned. Oh, I'm never going to find someone that really loves me. Oh, I'm just no good in relationships. I don't know how to even make a healthy relationship work, right? So I am not someone to put down the ego, okay? The ego is perhaps our greatest gift, in that it allows us it protects us through really shitty stuff. And then it guides us through these awesome experiences that we have in life. And so if the ego gets caught up on a certain coping mechanism, maybe that doesn't serve you anymore, but it did at one time. It wouldn't have created it if it didn't. So you need to love and respect that. Your ego's been through a lot. And it has tremendous power and authority to be able to even wrap its head around anything that I'm even talking about today. So I really get a little chafed when I hear people talking about how terrible the ego is, or the mind, or whatever, and how it just prevents us from living these spiritually awesome lives. And it's like, that's just another example of splitting, of trying to put things into boxes, okay? So I want to talk a little bit more about the two voices that we have in our heads, the seeds of self-sabotage, right? And, the victim and the judge dynamic, these are really the co-authors of really damaging self-stories. So one voice is that of the judge, and the judge is constantly looking for what you and others are not doing right, okay? And your judge, it just has impossible standards. And so then your victim self is always looking for the judge's validation, which of course it never receives. And so the victim always seeks out a judge, be it internal or external, to prove its unworthiness, okay? Now, releasing a victim mentality is very difficult, however, because you get sympathy. You get to feel good about yourself because whatever it is, it's not you, right? And you get to blow off the experience and not deal with your role in it. On the downside, perceiving yourself as a victim is probably the strongest rejection of I create my own reality that there is, okay? And so a person who thinks that everything happens to him or her, poor me, the universe is unjust, the more disempowered that person is going to be, and the more they're going to receive that lesson over and over and over again. Because it's also a fragmentation from reality. It removes the creator from the creation, okay? But on the other hand, if you accept your responsibility for your part in a situation, it is the strongest acceptance of the idea that you create your own reality that there is. And so you find yourself in every situation asking the question, what part of this is me? And the more in touch you can be with me, like the part of you that is actually present in that situation, the better you can make a discerning decision about that. So instead of asking the universe to prove to you that you create your own reality, so you can kind of sit on a fence and either accept or reject what happens, try taking it as a given that your life and everything that happens in it is actually created by you. And when I say you, I'm talking about the transcendental self, right? The true self, the entirety of your being, which is actually different than the me or the I, which we associate with limiting beliefs or the boundaries of the ego, which is wonderful and precious, but it's not the entirety of you, right? So we can think of the ego as like the thinking mind or conscious reality. So it may not necessarily be cosmic meaning per se, but rather, what does your situation suggest about where you are in your life, who you are in your life, what you're creating in your life, and what maybe you're denying in your life? Okay. So for example, let's say that you are at a job that you absolutely despise, yet you're worried about getting fired. Maybe you should be fired. Maybe you should be fired. Maybe that's the whole point, right? And then you get fired, and then you're like, woe is me, I got fired from this job you effing hated, right? So your soul is like, yeah, you hate this job. Let's get fired. But rather, the ideal situation there is you say, yeah, I hate this job, so I'm going to take charge of my life and find a different one, or start my own business and not wait for, oh, well, there's just no jobs out there. I have to suffer with this. Okay. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about that. Now, in our last live feed, I used a singing bowl, and we did kind of a short exercise on going in and just looking at the inner space of the third eye. So today what I'd like to do is kind of another activity, which sometimes I combine with that other activity, is automatic drawing. So part of stepping into your life as a creator is establishing a connection with, as I said before, that language that we all have, that playful language of metaphor and of fantasy and of play and creativity. And so part of stepping into becoming a creator in your life again is actually experiencing the feeling of creating, right? Because we could talk about universal law right now, but this idea of law of attraction, like the more you start bringing creativity back into your life, the more you focus on being a creator in it, the more you're going to attract that kind of energy. Okay. So I'm going to do a brief exercise to demonstrate for you what I mean by this. And so I'm going to create what's called an automatic drawing. I don't think you can, no, you're not going to be able to see it. So I'm going to do it very briefly. I'm going to show you on the screen what I did. So basically I'm taking 2 drawing implements. I'm using markers just because it will read well on the screen. So I'm taking one in each hand, okay, and I'm just going to put it on the page, and I'm just allowing my hands to move, okay? You probably would be a benefit if you tape the paper down. But the reason I'm using 2 hands and I'm doing a lot of crossing the center line with my hands is because it aids in what's called bilateral stimulation. So if you have limiting beliefs in that victim-judge dynamic that you are struggling with, it may also be that, particularly if you have attachment wounds and or trauma history, that your right brain, which has to do with your creative side, right? It's the more experiential side, the more affective side, has experienced some form of neglect and or collapse or overstimulation, okay? And so the left brain kind of takes over, and the left brain is really more the part of you that tends to be kind of hypercritical, okay? So right now I'm kind of moving my hands and I'm crossing the center line, and I'm as I'm physically, remember I talked about a lot of the unconscious stuff being in the body, as I'm physically moving my body across the center line and point, right, which means that I'm crossing them across my body's center line, that I'm actually encouraging a sense of integration. So there's things that I'm thinking about and I'm talking and I'm examining it through my left brain, but I'm also moving my body, which means I'm stimulating my right brain as well. Okay, so now I have this image, okay, and obviously it's a big scribble. It does not have to look like anything. It's a big scribble, okay? But whatever, you know, so now I'm going to assign a narrative to it, okay? So this is how I am feeling in this moment. And I got the flu yesterday. Today I have strep throat. I'm hopped up on antibiotics and painkillers right now. So that's the only reason I'm sitting here doing this video. But so I have some stress in my life. And so what is it that my body is calling me to pay attention to in making this drawing? So what I might do is just in the drawing, okay, remember it's just a scribble or a squiggle right now. In the drawing, I'm going to now try to pull out shapes. Now there's a couple ways you could do this. You could pull out shapes like I'm going to do, or you could just fill in the negative spaces with whatever colors you want, and it creates kind of an abstract image. I tend to be more of, I actually have a very active third eye. So symbolism and things like that comes very easily to me. And that's kind of third eye generated. I have found that certain kinds of art forms are more expressive. And I tend to think that people who have more expressive art forms, their energy is more concentrated in the body. Okay. But anyway, so I'm just finding some shapes right now and I'm fleshing them out. And then I'm going to take a look at it and I'm going to ask myself, like, what is it? What, just kind of free associate a little bit, like what comes to me. Okay. So I'm not going to belabor this point too much, just because it's really more of an exercise to demonstrate what and how you can kind of start to explore these things and establish that connection with your inner self and that playful language that we all have inside of us, right? So I'm just going to quickly do this. And then I'll probably have to sort of ruminate on it a little bit more afterwards. Okay. So this is what came up for me. And I added in there. So there's a couple questions that I would ask at this point if I were asking myself these questions. So like I might say, you know, tell me about this. What's the first thing that draws your eye? You know, tell me about the stars. Tell me about the bullseye in the center of whatever the shape may be. And then I'd ask, like, what does the shape say to you? What comes up for you when you look at this? And then I would just kind of riff on whatever that person might say. So for me, what comes up is I read this as figurative, almost like three heads, you know? And when I ask myself what comes up, I sort of see the stars as like two hands, and it feels like there's abundance there. But I'm kind of feeling pulled in a lot of different directions. And as a result, like, my grounded sort of centered self is getting a little bit muddled. Like I'm feeling a little ungrounded, and it's probably also in part having to do with physical illness that I'm experiencing right now. And so like I might ask, well, what message would the drawing have for me? And I might say, well, slow down and become more centered and grounded. And I think maybe that's what these are on the bottom. I view these as feet, and like maybe these are just points of contact with some kind of ground to like try and ground myself a little bit more, get out of my three heads. And then I might say, okay, well, if there's something that this figure might need, like if I could add anything to this drawing that would benefit the figure, like what would the figure need? Okay, I think I know. So I'm going to add it to my drawing, what it is that comes up for me immediately. And I try not to think too hard about what the responses to that would be, right? So what's really coming up for me is I think I need help. Like, I think I just would like some support. And I know this pertains to different aspects of my business. So I just added these like figures, like I just need more support, right? And so then, like, you know, if we could then move into a more action-oriented way of looking at these things, like who are your supports right now? Where could you gain additional support? What are the areas in which that you could hand off some of your responsibilities to? How could you make that happen, right? So then that becomes kind of like the action step part of the conversation. But before getting up to all of that, we just kind of allow this sort of unconscious conversation to happen, and we look at it on the outside, and we're able to really talk about it through metaphor. And then we kind of circumvent that victim-judge dynamic and those limiting beliefs that you may have. Now, if we had a long session, I could even take it further and say, okay, so now let's take this image, you know, like take a look at it, take a snapshot of it in your mind's eye, and then we would like close our eyes and go in and bring that image into the body, maybe even into the third eye, and ask for guidance around it, and ask it like, and watch it. Maybe it changes. Maybe the supports come to life and give you some information as like where you could find that support, right? Because when you bring it into the body, you start asking your higher knowing, what's your guidance here? Okay. It depends on how far you go with your spiritual beliefs. I tend to be someone who does believe in angels and spirit guides and esoteric beings. So I might call one of them in to help me interpret what I'm witnessing. Maybe you don't. If you don't believe in that, but you do believe in some kind of energy or whatever, then I use language like your higher knowing or aspects of yourself, the part of your brain, the other 92% of your brain that we don't have conscious access to, right? So that is as much as I wanted to share with you today for the second myth about the third eye. And our next video, I will talk about the third. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I would love to hear your comments below. If you make a squiggle drawing, which I would love y'all to do if you're willing to do it, if you make a squiggle drawing, I'd love to see it in the feed below as well if you're willing to share. Thank you so much. Have a great night.